Hello and welcome to Wine Grants. I'm your host Dave Moss from the Unfunded List and the Moss Family Foundation. With me this week is Joel Braunold of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Say hello, Joel.
Hello.
We are drinking we're having a particularly Jewish episode of Wine Grants. We are two Jews.
Indeed.
And we are drinking wine from the
Tishbi winery.
From the you were more familiar than I. From the Tishbi winery in the Is this in the Golan Heights?
No, it's not. It's in Israel. In a small village of Zichron Yaakov, where actually my family currently live.
Well, hello to Joel's family.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, L'chaim. Thank you for the wine. Although they are probably asleep at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, now is the time on Wine Grants where I read my guest bio out loud, which I will do without delay. Joel Braunold, I practiced and everything. Joel Braunold serves as the executive director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, a coalition of over 90 different organizations working in every sector of society, building relationships between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. He works regularly with the United States State Department, USAID, the National Security Council, and Congress on the needs of the peace-building community. Outside the U.S., Joel has worked with national governments across Europe, multilateral institutions, and parts of the Arab world. Joel learnt about U.S. politics from the West Wing, only to be disappointed by reality.
It's very sad. There's no mood music to help you.
I had very similar experience. I haven't had a walk and talk in a while, although that does happen sometimes here at the Lookout.
Mm-hmm.
Joel is an alumnus of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and holds a BA honors with distinction in philosophy from Bristol University. He is the recipient of the Avi Schaefer Peace Innovation Prize. He's a senior fellow for the Alliance of Youth Movements and holds honorary life memberships to the National Union of Students in the United Kingdom and the Union of Jewish Students, also in the United Kingdom. Welcome to the booth, Joel. Mazel tov.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here.
There is a conference in town this week that you are here for, which we will not be talking about because I don't really want to. And there's many other things for us to talk about. Oh, thank you for starting the timer. I usually forget. I was totally gonna get to it, but thank you very much. It will help us. It's always good to have a nice casual conversation when there's a clock running.
Oh, always. I feel that's how I perform best.
The wine will balance it out.
The wine on the clock.
There are a few reasons to have you in. One, it's always whenever someone from the MacArthur Foundation suggests that you talk to somebody, I feel like you should follow up with that. So we were both introduced by Jeff from MacArthur. Thank you for the introduction, Jeff. Hopefully you're a listener. The organization you run,
Mm-hmm.
very interesting to me for several reasons. And one of the things we've talked about on the show several times, and is just a general philosophy of mine, is that funders should collaborate more, and that could cause organizations to collaborate more.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think you probably could be doing more work on that front, but more than really anybody else, I see that happening here. Lots of organizations out there that'll have a partners page in the annual report. I've done it myself. Basically, just anybody I ever spoke to, find their logo and put it on a page.
Indeed.
You have some real partnerships that involve money and lobbying and other grown-up activities.
Mm-hmm.
Because the work you're doing is definitely grown-up work. If there's anything that requires adults and maturity and a correct approach on all fronts, it's peace-building work.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's true for most of the problems that we're trying to solve with philanthropy.
Yes.
Last night we had an event, Pitchcraft event, here at the Lookout. We had several nonprofits come working on. There were a few that were working with veterans, a few working on the homelessness problem in D.C., some folks working with rape survivors, program helping kids play sports, all sorts of great stuff, really great pictures. Everybody who came was fantastic. Hardest part of the night was picking a winner. It was Miriam's Kitchen, solving the problem of homelessness. This is an issue that I would say is not, that could learn a lot from your approach. And since we have you here in the booth, and you're the executive director, let's have you talk a little bit more in detail about the Alliance for Middle East Peace
Sure.
and how that operates. And
So, thanks for having me, and thank you for the wine. It's really delightful on a Saturday night to take a break from a conference and be able to speak with you.
this is nice.
So, ALMEP, or the Alliance for Middle East Peace, is for all intensive purposes a trade association. We're a 501c3 legally, but we act as a trade association for all of the groups working on building relationships on the ground in Israel and Palestine between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians, from after school programs to security cooperation and everything in between. And what we are is not a community of purpose. It's not like all of these 93 groups share a common outcome. What they share is a common need. And the need that they all share is to increase their resources. Whether that might be human capital, and we have a full-time regional team that helps the group partners, helps the groups partner better together, build their human capital. How can they think about scaling their programming? How can they move from just small aspirations to large ambition? So that's one side of resources. Another side is financial, pure cash. That's why I do a lot of the advocacy work and lobbying in DC. We've actually been responsible for over $80 million in federal grants that have gone directly to grassroots groups working on the ground over the past 8 years. And we can go into that a bit more depth. Or if that's attention. And attention is not more positive news stories. I think that the reality of today's media is if it bleeds, it leads, and we're not going to get the attention in that way. What it means is collectively we can frame our work into a systematic approach. And instead of being seen as nice or cute, as many people see this as kittens and kids in camps, they can see this as necessary. And just as necessary as economic development, or just as necessary as security cooperation. And in doing so, we become part of the foreign policy toolkit. And that's very important, because if we're ignored, or if we're seen as cute, you're pushed to the side, not just by policymakers, but also by philanthropists. This is always like well, I need to chuck some money at the wall, so why not? Rather than thinking about this strategically. And what we do as a coalition is really enable people to see this systematically and show how the groups work in different parts of society, work together and can scale. And all of my members pay membership dues, ranging from $100 to $4,000, so they have skin in the game. And lastly, we as an alliance, we don't compete with our members for competitive grants. So we won't apply to EU grants or US aid grants or USIP, United States Institute for Peace. So our members make up around 15% of our budget, and the rest we get from private foundations, individuals, who often recognize the leverage we do. So if you take a group like Hand in Hand, which is a bilingual Jewish Arab school that runs a budget of $6 million, let's say you're a foundation that supports them $150K. Because of our work with the US government, Hand in Hand could apply for a $1.2 million grant that it won this year for its programming. So you look at ALMEP as a leveraged donation. By giving you $30,000, $40,000, we enable some of our grantees to apply for far greater sums from the US government. So that's how we sort of operate and do our work.
Is that the pitch you make to foundations?
That's one pitch. So one is the leverage pitch.
Does it work?
Yes. So some foundations, for the ones who understand, especially around DC.
Some, though, leverage will not be. Why would I care about that?
Why would I care? So another pitch that we make is cooperation. A lot of people, as you put in the introduction, talk about partnerships, right? There is a difference between talking about.
I got a lot of partnerships.
Yeah, exactly.
Huge. They're going to huge partnerships. I'm going to be so good at partnerships, your head will spin.
Whereas actually the work of building a community is very difficult. In a space where everyone's competing, you need to have a neutral convener. And when we call an event, we might have a tiny budget, but when we call an event or we convene for a larger group or forever, we get 50, 60 NGOs to turn up. That is not normal. And they'll turn up we manage to build support networks amongst the staff, help alumni cross over different groups, and funders love that. So that's another reason. I think the third pitch we make is on this framing. For many people who have invested in this space for many years, they're frustrated that their friends or their colleagues are like, well, you're just, pissing money up the wall. And you're not. But you need to be able to frame it in a way that, one, you can explain to fellow board members or to your friends or colleagues or to your board if you're at a staff level. And you can do that as a collective, not just from a collective of which grantees you pick out of the portfolio, but as like the whole community who are working on this. I think that our ability to frame that, and we can go into that if you're interested about how we do that, is very interesting for people. And so those are the pitches. And if all that doesn't work, A lot of people like a British accent, so we hope that that can help
Yep.
as well.
Yeah, that's got to be one of your bigger advantages. A lot of very smart stuff in there that some of which I'd like to respond to.
Sure.
As you were talking, it reminded me. I think did you say kittens?
Kittens, kids, and camps.
Kittens. Is there a program that involves kittens?
Interestingly, the agricultural minister of Israel, Uri Ariel, who comes from the far right, wanted to deport all of the male cats in Israel to a third-party country to deal with their cat problem. So we don't have a kitten program, but if there was, we could probably make it.
I did notice a lot of stray cats.
There are a lot
on my recent trip.
Indeed.
I liked them.
Ah, great.
They're big, very nice.
No, but
cats.
we don't have a kittens program, but we do have kids in camps.
Interesting. So here in DC, there is a rat problem, but there is a program that rounds up feral cats.
Really?
You don't see stray cats very often because there's a program that rounds them up and puts them down. And I've since I moved to town, I've been trying to get a word in with the city council that this problem can solve itself.
If you let the cats out, the
There's
rats will be
literally
done.
no one who would prefer, even people allergic to cats. It's better than, and we got
rats.
big rats. You've probably seen our rats. You've been here. When the winner last night, May from Miriam's Kitchen was making her pitch, one of the things that she was talking about is, they've been around for a little while, and when they started, they were a soup kitchen, exactly as you understand a soup kitchen to be. They have innovated over the years and are much more. Obviously, they're homeless and they're hungry and they have to be fed. It is a major, crucial part of their program, but that's not it. There's job training there. They have really, their big pivot has been towards the collecting data on the pathways out of homelessness and helping people find those pathways. And they've found a lot of success with that.
Sure.
In particular on veteran homelessness in DC. They, last night, over 1,500 homeless veterans have found homes since 2013.
It's amazing.
Through Miriam's Kitchen, just in the capital area, which is amazing, but it is a reminder that there were 1,500 homeless veterans
sleeping rough on the streets
in
of
Washington, D.C., which is where the Veterans Affairs Bureau is headquartered. Something I've said in the podcast before, there shouldn't need to be any nonprofit supporting veterans. There shouldn't.
It's true.
We have it's a massive budget. Don't send them anywhere unless you know you're going to be able to take care of them. Yep. That's it's got to be part of the decision you make. There'd be fewer wars if people thought that way. That's not so much what we're here to talk about, but that, like I said, that that as a funder of the issue you work on, I can say that is it's a challenge. Many of the programs seem similar, especially the ones that bring Jewish and Arab youth together. It's basically the same idea. The camp's in a different location, or there's a slightly different aspect to it. and I mean, it's hard as someone who's not going to do it full time to figure that out. I can totally see it being knowing that there's someone like yourself, with a nice accent that is really going in there, making sure these are the groups that are, on the ball, and we're allocating the funds appropriately. Having that work done, I can see that being very, very useful. The last thing I'd point out is I think if I were to go, I'd be really interested when I will have a follow-up meeting with Miriam's Kitchen, and I do plan to ask. And if they're listening, they can just email me, I guess, the answer. But I am curious to find out if they're doing any lobbying. I imagine they must be doing. There's no way they ignore the city council. They're a successful DC nonprofit, and that doesn't happen without knowing some people. But I wonder, how much of that, how much they're doing. I know lots of nonprofits of that sort that would find it that would be opposed to doing it, and I think that their main reason is that they generally don't understand that. I think the farther you get from DC, the more that's true. A lot of my friends back in Maine, particularly when there's a presidential election around, well, they'll start talking about lobbyists, and basically they're just legal. It's just legal bribery. That what a lobbyist does is they bribe politicians who then pass the bills that the lobbyists write, which is something that happens. But that's not what lobbying is. Lobbying is a fundamental activity of American democracy. It's protected 100%. By the First Amendment. Indeed. It is crucial. And one of the reasons why lobbying has that impression is because ordinary people who are trying to do good, don't do it as much and think that. And the oil companies and the sugar companies and the corn companies have no such animus towards lobbying. They, in fact, spend an enormous amount of money on it. And again, that is not necessarily bribery, and it's not necessarily that wrong. If we're going to regulate the oil industry, it would be wrong to not talk to representatives from the oil industry. but we should, and if the conservation industry doesn't show up to the meeting, that is, there's a saying about that.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear more from you, a lobbyist.
Sure.
Are you a federally registered lobbyist?
I am not, and it's an important definition.
Tell us what that means.
So, firstly, big shout out to the law firms of Squire Patton Boggs, Steptoe Johnson, and Jackson Lewis, all three of which have been pro bono supporters of ORMEP, and really so much of my training came through that. And I would encourage every nonprofit, find a law firm in DC who all want to do pro bono work.
All of them do.
And help them on the public policy practice. You can learn a lot there. Lawyers love going up to the Hill. They love leaving financial derivatives alone for a time.
It must be fun for them.
They love it. So first things first, everyone should Google, as they listen to me, 501c3 H1 provision. This is very important.
Yes.
Okay? The IRS makes it very clear that non-profit organizations can engage not in political activity, but in legislative activity. Political activity is, do you endorse a presidential candidate? All of those are big no-nos, right? Mm-hmm. You will lose your 501c3 status. I do not encourage anyone to be endorsing candidates or anything like that. That is the world of the 501c4s and super PACs, and if you want to do that, this isn't the place. Legislative activities is any activity that you're working with the legislative body. So in general, because this is a different part of the tax code that you have to read a bit before you do it, everyone's like, oh, I'm not going to do that. I'll just work with the executive, the administration. So I'll work with the Bureau of Veterans Affairs, or I'll work with the State Department or USAID, because I'm allowed to do that and I'm encouraged to. I can educate, I can talk to them, I can be a recipient of a federal or a local grant, and because of that, that's great. That's where I will hang my hat. But if you're not dealing with the legislative, that is generally where the budget is written. That is generally where if there are line items being cut out or grown, that's the conversation you need to be part of. People are scared because they don't understand that you are allowed. And there are two different ways you can be. You can either make the H1 provision, which is called the expenditure provision, or you could do the substantial test. So let's say you don't want to fill any more paperwork out on your 990.
I don't.
So if you don't, what it says is you're allowed to engage in lobbying, as in legislative activity with the legislature. That is, and I'll go into exactly what that means in a second, as long as it's not a substantial spend of your volunteer or staff time. What does substantial mean? Well, if you don't make the expenditure test, it just means substantial, right? You just got to try and work it out, and it's very messy, and if you get audited, it might be and it might not be. My suggestion, and this is not a legal suggestion, this is an executive director to anyone else.
Nothing you hear on Wine Rants should be considered legal or accounting advice.
So with that said, and thank you very much for that, Dave, I would urge people to make an expenditure one if you want to get involved in this. It's just easier to track your hours. But what this means is you are allowed to spend some of your time lobbying. Now let's be very clear. If you're just going up and speaking to lawmakers about Miriam's Kitchen and what you do, that is not lobbying. Lobbying means vote for bill number X, do X, Y, sign on X letter. Mm-hmm. It has to be legislative, pushing legislation. Vote for this, don't vote for that. Any general education you're doing, totally allowed, right? So if you want to speak to a congressman or you want to speak to your state representative or your district councilman about your program, you can do that and you don't have to worry about anything. But let's say you want to try and get the District of Washington, all right? Well, DC's difficult because of Congress, but let's just assume
we're in a normal city.
Let's assume we're in Chicago, right? I'm from Chicago, right? As my accent clearly says. Right? And let's say that you want to get your alderman to do something and help write a piece of legislation. So you'll go to your alderman and you'll be like, Alderman X, I think that we really need to try and make sure that in the city budget, we're allocating resources when we look at the budget to mental health issues in this district. And I want to help you build into the budget, and I want to lobby you and make you write in to lobby the budget committee to include an additional $10 million.
Mm-hmm.
Throw a number up, right? And you say, I'm going to go and help you convince your colleagues of this need. What lobbying really is not buying politicians off. I know that's the popular thing. What lobbying is adding legislative assets to lawmakers. If you're you've been elected to Congress, right? And you are representing the district of Massachusetts 4th District, and you sit on let's assume that you sit on Foreign Affairs for all intents and purposes, and you don't know a lot.
Great, I'm crushing it.
Look at this, you're crushing it, Dave. And let's say you don't know a lot about South Sudan. You don't, but you know there's an issue there, and someone comes to you and say, like, Congressman, it's really
As
important.
I understand, something has happened.
It's really important you pass this legislation about these sanctions regimes. And he's like, well, I can get my staff to research, but can you help me? Can you help me understand? That's what lobbying is. You help them write the bills, you help them do it, they look at it, they make their own suggestions, they look at their political stuff. If they like it, they'll run with it, they'll introduce it, they'll get colleagues to sign on. And often you're running around the hill, be that at the state capital or the federal capital, helping them sort of build support for that. Okay? That's what lobbying is. So let's assume that's what you want to do. You're Miriam's Kitchen and that's what you want to do. If you make an H1 provision, there is a table that says how much money out of your budget you can spend on lobbying. So let's assume that you have less than $500,000 as your annual budget. I run a budget of $370,000. Okay, and we push. I'll give you my practical example. We push a lot. We push two pieces of. We have two legislative agendas. One is an annual appropriation, an annual spend in the Foreign Affairs 150 budget to spend $26 million a year on global peace and reconciliation work, of which $10 million we line item to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's not in the federal budget. We added in congressionally. So we work with appropriators, we work with different members of Congress to do this work, right? If with my budget of under $500,000 a year, I am allowed to spend 20% of my budget on that. Okay, that's my staff time, my salary and stuff. I can spend of my total budget 20%. And that's my expenditure I'm allowed to spend up to vote for bill number X, writing letters.
That spending isn't here, Congressman, is some cash in an envelope.
No, it's spending in terms of your staff time.
A lot of people get that part wrong.
Wrong, yeah. In general, again, non-legal, I think that if you're making financial contributions to congressmen in order for them to pay attention to non-profit issues, you're doing something very wrong. You know, it's
as an individual, you're capped at what, $3,000. It's not gonna. You're not buying influence at that.
And if you're doing that, you're not actually getting influence, right? The member of Congress or your state representative wants to listen to you because you're solving a problem. And ultimately, I know it's not popular, especially in an election year. Politicians are elected to solve public problems, okay? And in foreign policy, to do this sort of work. So we have that piece of legislation, the appropriation. And the other thing that we have is we're pushing an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace that looks to scale up funding. And if you're interested, Google HR 1489, sponsored by Congressman Crowley and Fortenberry. It's really interesting and there's cool stuff there. So you can spend up to 20% of your budget. And then there's another formula that if you want to do grassroots lobbying, that means let's say that you have a membership list of 20,000 people and you want them to call their representative to support HR, whatever. You can spend a proportion of that on grassroots lobbying. Now, the larger your budget, the larger you're allowed to spend on, the percentage you can spend on lobbying sort of shrinks and sort of the amount you can spend on grassroots. It's very easy to find this information. As I said, Google 501c3 H1 provision. So that is the legal background. You are completely legally allowed to lobby and you are encouraged to lobby and to do so to track your hours so that you can be part of the legislative process to try and help people do it. You cannot just be a lobbying shop. That's not your job. That's why it's capped at 20% under $500,000, right? That's not your job. If you're just doing lobbying, and I do many other things, I work on the ground, I manage, I have to fundraise, I do a lot of things. If I'm honest,
you go on podcasts.
I go on podcasts with Dave. I write articles. I do lots of other things. Lobbying is very much, realistically, is under 20% of my time. It's busy during appropriation season, and other parts it's not. And a lot of my work is advocacy, not lobbying. And the difference, as I said, if you're speaking to the administration or you're speaking to other foreign governments, if you're not speaking to a legislative branch and pushing a legislative proposal, that's advocacy, not lobbying. So remember, the law is encouraged you to tell as many public officials about what you're doing as possible, and you're only capped when you're pushing legislation. That's lobbying, right? So that's the encapsulation of that. The flip side of this, and I push this back to you as a philanthropist, is that many philanthropists are terrified of lobbying. And because there is something for private foundations that says that if they give a grant for lobbying purposes, they have to pay tax on it. So let's be very clear what that means. And again, this is not accounting advice. Check with your accountant, but the IRS is very clear on this. If you earmark a grant just for lobbying, yes, you have to pay tax. If you give a general operating support grant to a non-profit, and they use some of that for lobbying, that's fine. You don't have to pay anything on that. If you restrict the grant, however, saying you can do anything with this except for lobbying, the non-profit can't use that income for lobbying, and you don't pay expenditure. but you are restricting them from actually participating in an activity they are legally allowed to do for no appropriate reason, in my personal opinion. Unless unless you're bored or as a philanthropist, you're particularly against lobbying, right? So that's sort of the legal part of it. What I would suggest, if anyone is interested in lobbying and what we do, go narrow and deep. You don't need to speak to 535 members of Congress. Work out who it is who makes the decision.
You'd kill yourself if you did.
You go crazy.
if you spoke to all of them, oh my God, so depressing.
So, very much so. So
some of them really are terrible people.
Well, I would say, in the interest of full disclosure, I work bicamerally and bipartisanship. So you work with everyone, but the key is,
I guess you have to, yeah.
You got to do it. I have met some very interesting individuals. But the key is go in as informed, work with, I am very happy, and this is probably something I'll regret later, to help any group who is interested in learning how to do this. I'll give you my words of wisdom in terms of what I've learned. But narrow and deep rather than wide and broad. Find the people who you need to convince and convince them. And by the way, the administration, whoever, Republican or Democrat, will love you a lot more if you're helping them argue for the budget lines that you're asking for a grant for. So if you're reliant, let's say, on the Department of Veteran Affairs giving you a grant to help with Veterans Affairs, they would encourage you to go and tell Congress how you're spending the money and show what good your program's doing. Because therefore, when the Secretary for Veterans Affairs has to go up to the Hill and testify, the Congress will know what he spent the money on because he's heard from the direct recipients of how you're using it. There is nothing, from my experience, that administrations like better, that if they love the program that Congress is supporting, for the beneficiaries of that program to come to Congress. And that's what we do so well. Congress supports this money because they want to see Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians build better relations. By us bringing those reps to Congress outside of all the news you hear about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, which is awful, giving them examples and showing them, bringing literal activists up, saying this is how the US aid helped me, how your generosity you've given on behalf of the American taxpayers helped me. There is nothing more powerful than that. And when the next budget year comes around, even though there's been budget cuts over the past 8 years with sequestration, our program has not been cut once. And if you look in the 150 account, which is foreign affairs, that is almost unheard of. We have done globally over $200 million to global peace building, and Israel Palestine, that's $80 million. I argue to find one foundation that has done that much money over the past 8 years just on this conflict and on peace and reconciliation. That was the US government, and that program was because of the work that we've been doing.
Birthright doesn't count.
Birthright's different, but yeah, I would argue that doesn't
if
count.
it does, I can.
Yeah, Michael Steinhardt could probably could very quickly own that up.
Oh, that's not peace building. They don't even claim that it is. So.
No, it's not.
All right, this has been very interesting, fascinating stuff. I've been in DC a long time, and I ran a youth nonprofit a long time ago, and I was apparently well within the law, but we met with several policymakers, and I'm now thinking that I should have been talking to them about. I had at the time assumed myself that I could advocate for an issue. So, for instance, at the time here in America, we have it is not illegal necessarily to hit children. In fact, in 19 states, the public schools hit children.
Wow.
And so I met with many public officials. It's a bill that gets introduced every year. Carolyn McCarthy in New York introduces it every possible time she can. And it never goes anywhere because obviously hitting children is up for debate. That's something that there's two clear sides to. But no, it's the South loves to do it, and it's not. They're never gonna. Those states aren't going to. They won't be forced by the federal government. And I could have been. I was surprised at how easy it was to meet with congressmen and even some pretty big time senators. We called up Tom Harkin's office at the time he was chair of the Education Committee, and he said, "Come on in." Yeah, I'm meeting like a couple days later. And in general, every time I wanted to go over there and meet with, you can always meet with someone from the staff, and usually the member. If you're like, I don't know, I run a foundation, so maybe.
So yeah, it might be a bit easier.
Maybe a little different.
But yeah, it depends on
I
what.
think if you have the gumption.
If you have the gumption, if you've got something to say that you think can help them do their job better, the whole Congress is open. Why is it? When people come from abroad, they find it fascinating that anyone can walk into the house.
Into the building.
You can walk right in. There is a reason for that. The reason is that Congress is open. It is open to listen to you, to hear from you, to ask you. And yeah, the numbers are confusing, the buildings are confusing, there's miles of marble corridor, and God only knows what's going on.
It's not the UN, though. I mean,
It's not the UN.
I got locked in a stairwell at the UN.
That is a terrible. I feel we should do a podcast just about your locked in the UN story. We could call it Clocks and Wine.
I got locked in there with Daniel Karpenshoff, who used to be a representative to UNESCO from Denmark.
As you do.
And I think I forget how we got out. It was touch and go there for a while.
Maybe so. That's a terrifying reality.
If you ever wonder why the UN behaves the way they do, just go and try to walk around the building, and it makes everything clear.
The other thing, and I recognize we're coming slowly but surely to not the end of the bottle of wine that I'm sure we'll continue to be drunk.
Yes.
But potentially our time together. The other thing that I just say, outside of the lobbying stuff, which I said is very much less than 20% of my time, I was with someone who's just about to become a more senior person at USAID, and we were having a conversation. Allmap is unique because you've managed to create, from a disparate group who are always competing with one another for funding, a community, and that's not normal. And I can't stress enough. People talk a lot about community and do very little to invest in it and build it. Having a neutral arbiter or a convener that isn't a funder. We don't accept any money. We grant money. That's not what we do. We are like a trade association. We ask for bigger pots of money from private foundations, for philanthropists, individuals, and then our members compete for it. So we have no dog in this race, right? We're not like a collective giving pot. So because of that, everyone only benefits from the network, and being able to invest in that and do that creates this platform that you can form real partnership from. We had an example. There was one group working in the West Bank that had an awful reputation amongst its peers for no good reason. Right? It was a great organization. These things happen. So we held a round table for our members in their office. And what we found was that from that, people saying, oh, you guys are actually really good. And the next demonstration, they were all invited and they all participated. And this was something that wouldn't have happened. Today, I was with two people who were famously opposed to one another from two different organizations. And we put them in a room together and we said, get over it, right? We could have the ability to invite both of them there because we have that ability as like their convener. And the more we can find, and foundations are very good at this with their grantees, but often they'll say one thing to their the grantor, like their foundation, because they want to have that good relationship. But when the foundation leaves the room, they're all at each other's throats again saying, fund us more, fund them less. Finding these abilities, and Allmap's one, I didn't found it, a wonderful guy called Avi Meierstein did, who's now the president of my board. But the more we can replicate this model, and what I was talking with the guy from the administration is how can we replicate this in other conflict zones? How in South Sudan, how in Libya, how in Yemen? It doesn't mean that you all agree with the outcome. But it's about if you all have a common need and you all feel that you need to be taken more seriously and you all need to make sure that you have a voice when people are making funding decisions. And the reality in peace building today is that bilateral assistance, government to civil society, is normally the biggest pots of money for that. How can we best inform those making the decisions, often congressmen and senators or their staff who do not have a lot of time, that they can be the best informed that they can be? And I feel like the Allmap methodology and the format of it is something that I would love to see replicated in multiple places.
I agree strongly. I'd say beyond conflict zones. Like I mentioned, I think this is something. And for all I know, I don't want Miriam's Kitchen to think I'm picking on them. For all I know, they are a member of some sort of alliance. I look forward to talking about that. If they're not, strongly encourage it. Maybe we can set something up here in DC. There are similar examples out there. I think it's definitely something that should be pursued. Thank you very much for coming. I think next time you're in town, let us know. We'll have you by. As always, I want to thank our hosts, The Lookout, which is a beautiful community for filmmakers located in the Adams Morgan neighborhood of Washington, D.C. I want to thank my guest, Joel Braunold.